So President Trump has been permanently banned from Twitter, and honestly, he's nearly been purged from every single social media site online. I'm going to go ahead and run through it for you so you know the specifics. What you're about to hear, all of these sites, all of these outlets, he's either permanently banned or like banned at least until the inauguration, and then they're going to revisit it. It depends, you know, you got to go site for site here, site by site. But there's been basically disciplinary action taken by Facebook, Instagram, which is apparently part of Facebook. They banned him at least until Inauguration Day. Reddit banned him for inciting violence. Twitch banned him from posting new content at least until Inauguration Day. YouTube removed some specific Trump videos that allegedly advocated violence. Snapchat locked Trump's account. TikTok banned certain videos of Trump for promoting violence. Discord banned the Donald server. And then here's another one that's, this one's real left field to me, but Shopify took down 2 Trump online stores. They took down 2 Trump online stores. So listen, effectively, what we're talking about here is an attempt to do the internet death penalty. That's what it is. Now, obviously, the incident that led to this reaction was, you could call it the coup attempt, the attempted insurrection, the riot, whatever you want to refer to it as. I'm not going to, argue too much over how you want to define it and how you want to label it. But what happened was you had this event that was supposed to happen in D.C. with all of President Trump's people. Trump went and gave a speech at the rally where he basically said, we have to be tough, we have to be strong, we have to make sure that everybody knows we won this election, it was a fraudulent election, and we have to fight. We have to make sure we fight. So if you go watch, the wording in the speech that he gave to his people before they stormed the Capitol, yes, there's a lot of really bad stuff that he said there, which can easily be interpreted as like, go do the thing that you ended up doing. But then what happened was, as this was going on, there were conflicting reports about how Trump was reacting behind the scenes. But he went on Twitter and he basically spoke out of both sides of his mouth. So as the attempted insurrection was happening, Trump went on Twitter and he basically said, we love our law enforcement. We support our law enforcement. Everybody be peaceful with our law enforcement, because there were reports that some of the Capitol Police were getting hurt by the protesters. So he goes out there and says, be peaceful. Make sure you protect our boys in blue. But then he also would say in the very next sentence that this was a fraudulent election. This was a stolen election. It's unacceptable what happened with this election. And so he was speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Hey, be peaceful and support our police officers and law enforcement, and also, isn't this a terrible fraudulent election? Shouldn't we all be really pissed off about the results? And this is unacceptable, and maybe somebody should do something about it. So he did that. He did that a number of times. Now, the next day, Trump came out, and apparently, his own staffers finally got through to him, and he basically gave a speech that was more conciliatory, and he said, yeah, there's going to be a peaceful transition to power, and, he kind of was more clearly against the attempted insurrection the next day, effectively throwing his own most hardcore supporters under the bus because of what ended up happening. There were reports he didn't like the optics of it, and it looked low class to him, like what people were trying to do, and the fact that you had a number of people died, over 50 injuries, like 5 or 6 people, I think, died, including some police officers. At least one was beaten to death, which is, again, this is from the crowd of people that say they're the most pro-police, and then that ended up happening. But so he sort of flipped his tone the next day and kind of came out against what happened. Okay. Well, then you have the internet death penalty effectively happens. They basically kicked him off the internet as much as humanly possible. Obviously, at the top levels, there was coordination. Now, what makes sense in this scenario? What is reasonable? What's unreasonable? Well, you guys know my general take when it comes to social media sites. I'm of the belief that the big social media sites should effectively be treated as the new public square. They should be public utilities. you should have the First Amendment expanded to, protect free speech on these platforms. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that literally anything goes, because, you can't... I mean, the best example of exceptions to freedom of speech are like direct threats of violence. So if somebody does a direct threat of violence, you're not protected to do that. You're not protected to do a direct threat of violence. That even violates the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and it's illegal. So then the question becomes, okay, well, is what happened here a direct threat of violence? So in other words, was Trump flat out inciting the riot? And if you look at that question and your conclusion is like, yes, Trump was doing that, well, then you could look at the actions of Twitter and you could look at the actions of perhaps some of the other outlets and say, it's not them, it's him. He was directly inciting violence and he was egging these people on, and so they took appropriate action. That's how some people might view it. And, my opinion on it, and I understand that because I polled you guys on whether or not it was fair, whether or not it was the right thing for Twitter to ban Trump in the wake of what happened this week, and 68% of my own audience said, yes, in fact, it is fair for them to do what they did. I do have to say, I think Trump spoke out of both sides of his mouth, and he gave himself just enough cover where he wasn't directly threatening violence. And this comes down to a conversation about basically the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, the letter of the intent versus the spirit of the intent. So like if you quote everything Trump said and write it down on a piece of paper, what you see is, yeah, he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He's saying, be peaceful to our officers, we need to make sure that we protect our boys in blue, and also this election was fraudulent and terrible and wrong, and somebody needs to do something about it. So on paper, there's enough wiggle room that he gave himself where it's not a direct incitement of violence. I don't see that at all. But in terms of the spirit of what he was saying, yeah, I think he certainly violates the spirit of it, and he's clearly egging them on, even though he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So again, the question becomes, do you view it as a direct threat of violence? Do you view it as a direct incitement of violence? Or do you think he left himself enough wiggle room where effectively he can sort of get out of it? And as much as it pains me to say it, I think it's totally true. I think he left himself enough wiggle room where he could get out of it. Now, that didn't stop these outlets from doing what they did and effectively banning him. But listen, then that gets into a much broader conversation, which is a lot of these outlets, like Trump didn't even say those things on a lot of the outlets that ended up banning him. You know what I mean? Like, he didn't say these things on Discord. He didn't say these things on Reddit or Twitch. These things weren't said on Facebook. But Facebook took the action and was like, well, we're going to ban him anyway. And so then it becomes like, it's not even like these outlets are reacting to, for example, a direct incitement of violence on their platforms. They're saying, hey, this guy did something that we view as a direct incitement of violence. Again, debatable, but they could say that elsewhere. And since he did it elsewhere, we're going to pretend like it was on our platform, and we're just going to ban him from our platform too. So effectively what they're saying is, we don't like him, he's dangerous, he's bad, and so we're going to ban him because we don't like him, he's dangerous and he's bad. So again, it's not like he did these things on their platforms. They're just like, he could potentially maybe do something like that also on our platform, and so we're going to go after him. And then a really good, point is, but so if you're banning him and he's the only world leader that's banned, is the argument that Donald Trump, there are dictators that exist in this world. There are dictators that exist in this world. There are people who are just as bad, if not worse than Donald Trump, who run countries, who have power. You can't tell me that, we'll keep Benjamin Netanyahu up, but we're going to ban Trump because we don't like Trump, and Trump does direct incitement of violence. Whatever Trump's done on that front, you bet your ass that go talk to a Palestinian about Benjamin Netanyahu and, the 2014, for example, just destruction of Gaza where they bomb civilians nonstop. There's no argument that only Trump is bad enough to merit this kind of treatment. If you're going to open this door and do this kind of treatment, what the fuck is your standard? What is your standard? I mean, there's dictators in the world. There's a genocide of Rohingya Muslims. Look at what Saudi Arabia is doing to Yemen, effectively doing genocide and creating a famine. So you're going to tell me that perhaps like top Saudi government officials can remain on these platforms, but Trump has to go when, you know, there's people who are just as bad, if not worse than Donald Trump on these platforms. So the problem here is there is no standard. They're just saying like, we don't like him. He's done bad things and he might do bad things. And so he's got to go. And I'm not trying to downplay how serious what happened at the Capitol was. It is very, very, very serious. And there needs to be consequences. And I'll talk about those consequences in a different segment as to what I think the proper approach is and to how to deal with this. Because yes, you can't get away. I don't think you should let Trump get away with effectively egging on an attempted insurrection and have no consequences for that. That's crazy. Of course there should be consequences. But they really did, all the social media outlets really did drop the hammer. And what everybody is saying here is they're buying into the logic of unaccountable Silicon Valley oligarch billionaires should be able to shape the public discourse, which means Mark Zuckerberg and Jack have more power and more authority than the democratically elected leader of the United States of America, who's supposed to be, in theory, the most powerful person in the world. I don't want to buy into that framework. I don't think you can or should have a closed process that's like an authoritarian process where the heads of these social media outlets can just give somebody the internet death penalty, have no standard whereby they do it, and then you have like at least half the people sort of defending their actions. I don't think that makes sense. And just so you know, I'm not even like, it's not even like we make a slippery slope argument as like, well, what if X, Y, and Z starts happening to the left? Because you don't need the slippery slope argument because it's already happening. On Twitter, for example, the Red Scare podcast was suspended, and that's like a left-wing sort of anti-woke podcast. We already saw this with Chapo Trap House on Reddit. They were banned on Reddit. If you don't think that the censorship affects the left, go talk to the people from the Gray Zone. Go talk to Abby Martin. Go talk to Rania Khalek, Benjamin Norton, Max Blumenthal. These are all people who at one point or another have effectively been censored or deplatformed. You know, again, like I said previously, go talk to any sort of pro-Palestine activist groups and they get knocked for anti-Semitism even when they're not being anti-Semitic, and they get their stuff pulled down. So, my issue here is with the principle of how we make these decisions. And I don't think that these giant social media companies should have the power that they have. Listen, I get it. Don't get me wrong. Am I a total free speech anarchist where anything goes at all times? No, of course not. You can't abuse somebody. You can't harass somebody. You can't do direct threats of violence. You can't do libel. You can't do slander. But if Trump was basically directly inciting the coup and it was doing direct threats of violence, then use the legal process and go through the legal process in order to go after him. You know, we can redress these grievances through the framework we already have set up. Just like by the same token, I don't want Patriot Act 2.0 for what happened at the Capitol and further restrictions of civil liberties. I want you to use the laws that we already have on the books to go after the people who violated the law. You understand what I'm saying? So, there's whatever it is, 5 or 6 people who died. Go after the people who did this. They already arrested the guy who broke into Nancy Pelosi's office and stole her laptop or something like that. They already arrested a lot of these people who directly violated laws. Trump signed something earlier in the year, I think in response like BLM riots and protests, where he was like, if you harm a statue, a federal statue or something, a government statue, that you get like 10 years in prison. Okay, well, if you're doing something that's, breaking windows on federal property or whatever, you can use that same law and go after these people. I don't want new laws. I don't want Patriot Act 2.0. I want to go after people with the existing laws that are already there. You don't need to come up with new, more punitive, more restrictive, anti-civil libertarian laws. And so, to the extent that, anybody does direct threats of violence or abuse or incitement on any of the social media platforms, yes, use the existing infrastructure. Again, I think the solution is regulate all these as public utilities, all these big social media companies, so you expand First Amendment protections, but that doesn't mean it's literally anything goes. Insofar as somebody actually does incitement of violence or direct threats of violence, that is illegal, but go after them in an open, democratic, judicial process. As opposed to now, I refuse to say it makes sense to give Silicon Valley oligarch billionaires veto power over the public discourse to take down whoever the hell they want to take down. And unfortunately, that's where we are. Like, you can't even make the case that what Shopify did was reasonable. Shopify, I mean, there's at least some sort of stretch of an argument for the other social media companies, like, hey, we think Trump was inciting violence, so we're going to take him down from all the social media outlets because, maybe he can incite violence on our platforms. So at least there's a stretch of an argument for those outlets. But when it comes to Shopify, what's he going to do? Incite violence through a Trump online store? Of course he's not going to do that. So why would you pull that down? Because they're just trying to give him the internet death penalty because they think he crossed the line where it's merited that he gets the internet death penalty, and it doesn't matter that he didn't violate any specific rules or laws on that particular platform. We don't like him, so we're going to take him down. Okay, but then by that same logic, maybe Benjamin Netanyahu who should be pulled down. Mohammed bin Salman should be pulled down. You have people on Twitter who are like convicted murderers. So if we're saying it doesn't the things that are bad don't even have to be done on those particular platforms. If you're just bad enough of a person, we're going to take you down. Well, then shouldn't you take down every single murderer? Right? So again, there's no standard. There's no standard that we're using here. People are just saying, okay, Silicon Valley oligarch billionaires can get veto power over all of public discourse. And be careful what you wish for. I don't think people really realize what they're getting themselves into. Now, again, I'll talk in a little bit about what the actual correct response is and should be. What consequences should there be for what Trump did, which helped lead to the riots and the attempted insurrection? We're going to talk about that. And there should be consequences. I want to be clear about that. You don't just get away with egging on, insurrectionists effectively. But in terms of the reaction from the social media companies, I do think we are kind of in a post 9/11 mode where everybody's just sort of shutting off their brain and reacting more emotionally, and they don't even realize the path that we're going down. It's a very Patriot Act-like path, and you're handing the keys of the kingdom over to Jack and over to Mark Zuckerberg and others, and they shouldn't have this kind of power that we're giving them. So I understand that this is a take of mine that, a lot of people in my own audience are going to disagree with and perhaps disagree with vehemently. But, I don't want to sound smug or anything, but I do think that there will come a time where you'll look back and be like, oh, I now see why he said the things that he said and why he took the position that he took. Because how long did it take before we all realized, for example, how bad and wrong the Patriot Act was? What was it, 5 years after it was passed where everybody realized, or maybe it was as soon as the Snowden leaks came out where everybody realized, like, oh my God, what did we get ourselves into? This law is obviously terrible. And at the time, everybody's like, what? It's the Patriot Act. If you're a patriot, you support it. That's what the discourse was at the time. Do you want to protect us from the terrorists or not? So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on now in terms of this, where, people think if you're not in favor of the internet death penalty for President Trump, that effectively you're like pro-insurrection or pro-terrorist and you're like soft on white supremacist terrorists or whatever. I think that's silly. And I think people really need to think about the consequences of their actions and the consequences of what they're advocating for. And I don't see a lot of that occurring right now.